Communicating with data, choosing the best visual. Take a look at this chart of chart suggestions. If you have data, what would you like to show with that data? There's a lot of different ways you can visualize data. How do you feel when you look at this chart? Now, if I were to ask that question of a general audience and then create a pie chart of the responses, it might look something like this. With the vast majority of people feeling overwhelmed with presenting data or choosing how to present it. I'm Diane Windingland with Virtual Speech Coach. I coach and train subject matter experts to present with clarity and confidence, shaping what they know into presentations that engage and get results. Today's learning objectives are these. First, we'll look at some common assumptions that people have about communication and presenting data. Then we'll discover some of the benefits of presenting data in your presentations, a couple problems, and then we'll have a brief overview of chart selection. Assumption number 1, style trumps substance. You may have heard that communication is more about the sizzle than the steak. Or you might have heard that how you say it is more important than what you say. You might have even heard that communication is 93% nonverbal. You probably at one time have heard someone say something like this: the words you use are only 7% of communication. The rest of what you communicate is 38% tone of voice and 55% body language. Wow, that makes it really sound like how you say it is more important than what you say. The only problem is that's not true, or at least it has no relevance to presentations unless a communicator is talking about feelings or attitudes. So while I don't have any hard data, think back in history for a moment. President Abraham Lincoln was one of the most famous orators in United States history. As we look at first-hand accounts of Lincoln's speeches, he's been described as awkward, squeaking, and unpleasant. However, he held his audience in rapt attention. What you say, substance is important. Assumption number 2, data is dull. Okay, for most people, raw data is dull. Data without context means nothing to most people. Telling a story with your data is what gives it meaning. Cognitive psychologist Jerome Bruner says that a fact wrapped in story is 22 times more memorable than the mere pronouncement of that fact. If you can tell a story with your data, you and your audience can benefit in many ways. First of all, you as a speaker can have increased credibility when you include specific details. For example, I'm going to say 2 sentences. Which one makes me sound more credible as a speaker? Sentence number 1. A lot of people will get cancer in their lifetimes. Or sentence number 2. 38.4% of people will be diagnosed with cancer in their lifetimes. I'm guessing sentence number 2 with the specific percentage makes me sound more credible as a speaker. Including evidence or data can also contribute toward a sustained attitude change. Research has shown that the inclusion of evidence is likely to increase the sustained attitude change. So if you want to persuade your audience and keep them persuaded, include strong evidence. Finally, including evidence and data helps your audience make informed decisions. Although emotions are highly influential in decisions, data presented in a meaningful way can influence the emotions and support the need that most people have for logic and reason as well. So here's that statistic again on the lifetime risk of cancer being 38.4%. Now, that's only one statistic, and I certainly could present it like this. However, if I think about my audience, and let's say my audience is a group of parents with babies or parents that are expecting to have a baby, their first child perhaps, there might be a way to present that statistic, especially if I wanted to tell them that the choices they make in their child's early years nutrition can make a big difference in the likelihood of their child developing cancer later as an adult. So maybe for that audience, this might be a better way of presenting the data. They might forget that 38.4% statistic. But when they see 2 out of 5, almost 2 out of 5 babies will eventually develop cancer, that will probably hit home. Now, there are some problems with presenting data. One problem is that sometimes you are deluged with data. There is so much data. And you definitely do not want to do a data dump on your audience. That would be like a toxic dump for them. They would either be dismayed, confused, or bored. The other challenge is that your audience may not understand the data. They may not understand the context. They may not understand the analysis methods. So you always have to keep your audience in mind when you're presenting data. What do they need to know? What would the impact be for them? What kind of action could they take based on the data? The solution to these problems is to harness your inner child and ask questions. Here are 3 questions that you could ask before giving a presentation that includes data. What do you want to say? What do you really want to say? What is your message? What is your focus? Number 2, what does the data say? Does the data support what you want to say? And number 3, what does the audience need to hear so that they can make an informed decision, so that they can understand it, so they can relate to it? Ask yourself these 3 questions. What do you want to say? What does the data say? What does the audience need to hear? And then you can consider whether a chart might help visualize the data. So let's say that I wanted to talk about the number of households with cats. If I threw up this table that shows pets and the number of households in the US that have those pets, oh, that's interesting, but the statistic about cats is rather lost in that entire table. So maybe I would want to switch it up a little bit and talk about the percent of US households with cats using a column chart showing households with cats versus households that have no cats. Well, that may not be the best choice if I really want to focus on households with cats, because that looks a little less important. In this case, with only one statistic, maybe just text with a picture is good enough. I don't really need a chart. 38% of US households have a cat. Or if I wanted to round it, I could say nearly 40% or 2 out of 5. There are 4 basic chart categories to consider when you're presenting data. And within these categories, there are multiple types of charts. But the 4 categories are comparison, composition, relationship, and distribution. Unless you're really into significant data analysis, you probably will only use comparison and composition. And in our chart selection portion of this presentation, I'm only going to look really at 3 types of charts: the column chart, the pie chart, and the line chart, with both column charts and line charts being the comparison, and pie charts being composition. So here's that data set again. Take a look at it and think, how would you show this data set? Which chart would you select? Would you use a column chart, a pie chart, or a line chart? Take a moment and think about it. Now, I did try all of those charts and then some. So here's the pie chart. The number of U.S. households that own a pet by type of animal in millions. There's a few problems with pie charts in general, and this pie chart in particular. First of all, pie charts are designed to show a part-to-whole relationship. And in this data, there's an overlap. Some dog owners also own cats, for example. So a pie chart would be an odd one to really present this data with. What about a line chart? Well, to me, this looks even weirder than a pie chart, because line charts are best used when you want to show a trend. And this is just categories, not necessarily a trend. A column chart? Well, this is a lot better. But I thought, it really, having those long titles for the categories at an angle makes it kind of hard to read. So a variation of the column chart would be a bar chart. And this is a lot easier to read as a bar chart. When you're creating a chart, you might even consider whether you need all of the chart elements. So here's an example where I took out the grids and I actually added the data points. So I could talk about specific data points and people don't have to actually guess at the number. Now maybe there's a different chart you could try. In PowerPoint, there are a multitude of charts that you could insert. One of the newer charts in PowerPoint is a tree map, and just out of curiosity, I did a tree map of the data. And I thought this was a vast improvement over the pie chart for sure. And this was a lot easier to read and to actually look at the proportions of households that own different types of pets. It is a lot easier for humans to get a feel for quantities when they are in rectangular shapes versus circular shapes too. Then I thought, well, could I improve on this? What if I simply added pictures of the animals? Now, admittedly, because I had to find pictures of these animals, this did increase the time to make the chart. In PowerPoint, however, you can, for one set of data, try out different types of charts to visualize it differently. But I thought adding the pictures actually helped the quick understandability of this chart. Now, I looked at a different data set and looked at number of pets owned in the United States by type of animal. Even though the freshwater fish, there's not that many households that own them, because the households that do own them often have multiple fish, it ends up that freshwater fish is the type of pet that is in greatest number owned in the United States. So this is a different data set that shows some information a little differently. Go ahead, consider different ways that you might show your data. You don't have to be stuck with one way. Now, there are many considerations for your data. One of the most important is color considerations. Be careful of using color only as a distinguishing way of telling the difference between data. And you can check that by looking at your presentation in grayscale for people that might be printing it out, and doing a colorblind check. 7 to 10% of men are colorblind, so it's not an insignificant number of the population. Here was, through a website, I did a green blind version. Now, for this, being colorblind would not significantly change the understandability of this chart because there's designated sizes of the rectangles and I have animals in each one as well. But consider that you may have your presentation printed out in black and white, or that there are colorblind people in your audience. You can also look at infographics for ideas. This is one that graphically shows the minimum eye thickness guidelines. And this would be so much better than, say, a bar chart. Here's some suggested resources so that you could learn more. The website here is one that gives a great overview on different types of charts. And if you only have a few minutes, this is probably a great resource. Lynda.com, which is a free online resource through many libraries, has, I don't know, at least 100 courses, it seems, on visualizing data. And one that I thought would be particularly helpful, it's I think about an hour, 20 minutes long, is called Picking the Right Chart for Your Data. And then there's some books. If you just want a book on having beautiful presentations with a little bit on charts, this would be a great beginner book, Presentation Zen. A little bit more advanced, but not too advanced, is Storytelling with Data. And finally, Advanced Presentations by Design. This goes into more than just charts. In fact, the chart selector came from this book. It also goes into a whole method of doing advanced presentations that have a fair amount of data for a technical or business audience. Go ahead, make your data meaningful. Consider including data to increase your credibility, to have sustained attitude change, and to help your audience make informed decisions.